Let's come back to where we had gotten to in the first, not the first half so much, but instead of thinking of it as two parts, first part, second part, let's think of it maturely as a pair. If we move out of the mental conception of a duo, of a duality, into a pairedness, we are within realization, resonance of symmetry. And symmetry will have a resonance that is like a maturity of the resonance of pairedness. And in fact, they bear a mathematical ratioing which is classical. The classicality is that of the plane geometry figure of a triangle. Much is made of the Pythagorean triangle, the 3, 4, 5 triangle, where the square of 5 is 25 square, and the square of the 3 is the 9 square, and the square of the 4 is the 16 square, and those two squares equal this third square. That base. But the really powerful triangle for architecture is the equilateral triangle. It has 3 equal sides and 3 equal angles of 60 degrees. And the understanding of that does not come from numbers, from arithmetic, but it comes from observation of astronomy. If you get used to looking at the stars, mostly in the northern hemisphere of our world, in the starry patterns, there are certain patterns that stand out. The pair of 2 bright stars, Castor and Pollux, being Gemini. The 3 stars of the belt of Orion. The way in which the Pleiades cluster together, and in between Orion and the Pleiades is a big V headed by a very bright reddish-orange star, Aldebaran, and that V are the horns of Taurus. But in that constellation, one of the brightest stars that was significant is Sirius. It's a blue-white giant star. It's only less than 9 light years distant. It's the same kind of star as in the constellation of Orion. Down the big star below the belt on the right is Rigel, which is a blue-white giant as well. But Sirius is very close. Rigel is more than 900 light years away. Sirius in Egypt was called Sothis. And the rising of Sothis, not just Sirius, but always associated with the baboon, the African dog, sometimes called the dog star. The rising of Sirius indicated that the Nile was already beginning its flooding, and all of Egypt, all of the nomes, all of the districts should prepare for their sustenance of life, for their planting. So the rising of Sirius, of the dog star of Sothis, was the trigger for that whole renewal of life, of energy. And the very bright star that is associated with Sirius, because Sirius is the dog star, this was before the dog star rises, because Procyon, before the dog star, doesn't set. Its way of being above the horizon signals to those who know the constellationing of Sirius and Procyon, know that it's coming. It hasn't risen yet, it will. And as sure as Sirius rising, the Nile will flood and everything will be plantable in Egypt. But if you look at the line, a celestial geometry line between Sirius and Procyon, that distance has exactly the same distance as Sirius does to a very bright star in Orion. Just like Rigel is below the three belt stars, above the three belt stars, a very huge, enormous yellow star is called Betelgeuse in Arabic. Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse is so large that the surface of that star, if it were where our sun is, the surface of that star would be to the orbit of the planet Mars. You can't say big enough to get to that. It's about 1,000 light years away as well. But if you take a line between Betelgeuse and Sirius, and then Sirius and Procyon, you can draw that same line from Procyon to Betelgeuse. It makes an equilateral triangle in the sky. So that equilateral triangle becomes a hermetic, time-honored constellation of seeing visionly, that in the heavens, if we bring that constellation visionly to our world, we can construct with that, we can build with that, with great certainty that something fundamental has about to be done. And that equilateral triangle is one of the foundational visionary structures of Chartres Cathedral. One of the really interesting books that one can come out with, there's an Australian architect named John James. It's called The Master Masons of Chartres. It was published originally in 1982 and reprinted here. And there is also a book that came out, published in London by a very interesting kind of a group. Their organization is called Research into Lost Knowledge Organization. And they published a series of books called The Mysteries of So-and-so, The Mysteries of Stonehenge, The Mysteries of Machu Picchu, etc. And The Mysteries of Chartres Cathedral is the number one, is the first in that whole series. And the author, Louis Charpentier, is translated from Charpentier, translated from the French by Sir Ronald Fraser. And originally it came out in 1966, translated into English in 1972, and reprinted in this new series in 1975 by Avon Books, where all of the mysteries of such and so in architecture were published by Avon publishers. Charpentier is one of those French savants who understood that one has to look and learn to look, and in doing so, one comes to understand basic qualities like John James being an architect, and both of them as having manned crews of people over decades at these sites. John James at one time had the gift of about 20 architectural graduates that were clustered together at Chartres for a summer, and he got to direct them, and so they began doing what Brunelleschi and Donatello had done in the Renaissance. They went to a place like Rome and began measuring everything, especially Agrippa's Pantheon, to see how it was built. How do you build a massive dome that survives for 1,500, 1,600 years counting? And Agrippa's Pantheon is still there in Rome, just as he built it. It still works. And Brunelleschi's dome, Il Duomo, in Florence is now almost 600 years there. It works perfectly well. Chartres Cathedral has been there for 900 years and works very, very well. Went through vicissitudes, but the first architect to lay out the beginnings of what became Chartres Cathedral. We don't know his name, he's called Scarlet. All of the master architects of Chartres went by colors. And Scarlet was followed. He only stayed long enough, about a year, to lay out the way in which the overall shape, the sketch of how this is going to be. And the second master architect to come in was, his color was bronze. And bronze then is the one who set the basic foundational stones on what had been outlined and sketched and begun by Scarlet to build up the beginnings of the foundation of Chartres. And all of the building of the cathedral at Chartres lasted in the 1100s through that century. We have been talking last presentation, last week, and mentioning it 2 weeks ago, just before, a fortnight, 2 weeks ago. And why are we going by weeks? Because weeks are not the rags of time, but it is the cycle of a seven, of a Sabbath. And it was very clear. Jesus said, man is not made for the Sabbath is made for man. Because it helps him to compose time. And when he can compose time, he has a tether on the way in which he can compose and create in space and time. And if he can create in space and time, he can then teach himself the art of creation in imagination that teams with remembering, so that one then can build a Chartres. And at the same time as building it, to understand that you have to have the science that goes with it, because it's the other wing of the butterfly, folks. Art and science, vision and history, is the way in which a conscious space-time is workable and works. And if you can't compose in a quintessential five-dimensional visionary field, you don't have any art. And if you don't have any art, you don't have a way to raise populations that are able to understand history. And without history, there is no science. All of it gets sucked back into a dirty vacuum cleaner called the egotistical mind, full of conceptual this and that, and because it is cut off increasingly, doesn't believe in what it can't believe in, and so because vision doesn't occur, it doesn't believe in vision. And consequently thinks art is its own purview. It's what it does. And art is to arrange stuff, what people do, what animals do, what trees do, what land does, in terms of the way in which we've got it formulated. And you better do it. Because we have force. We have friendly force called jobs, economics. We have unfriendly force called police. And if it gets really rough, we have a military. And if that doesn't do it, we have some really secret stuff that will scare you. You will gladly jump from the 16th floor in a downtown hotel in a city where you are the Secretary of War, man. What is important is that bronze was succeeded by a number of colors. There was a ruby and a rose and an olive, and eventually by the 1190s, Chartres Cathedral was incredible. And then in 1194, it had a massive fire and burned. Not that the stone so much burned, but everything else in it, and the roofing and everything. All of that time, and the 1100s, the 12th century, has been recognized since the late 19th, early 20th century as a Renaissance also. Like Procyon, it was the Renaissance before the big Renaissance. And the reason why it was in the 1100s is that the 1100s are not just the century after the 1000th year, the 11th century, the 1000s. Well, if you're looking at millennium, the millennium was in 1100 AD, 1000 AD. And 1100 AD is certainly not the millennium, except for Hermetic learning, where one understands that these are movable feasts. The feast of the millennium certainly follows a carrier wave after 1,000 years. But there is a consolidation century of about 100 years, so that after about 100 years, and the Hermetica are written to celebrate the century after the carrier wave. They knew when Jesus was born. And by the time it was a century after that, was 89 AD. 91 AD would come and bring the trigger. And in 91 AD, there was a concerted fearfulness in the Roman Empire. The fearfulness was that something immense was brewing. They had decimated some 20 years before the temple in Jerusalem. It was done in Roman vicious style. They didn't just destroy it, they pried up all of the stones. They did the same thing with Carthage after the Second Punic War. They uprooted every building so that Carthage was no longer a city. It was completely erased. It was a barren, semi-desert field. This is what empires do when you challenge them. They erase any mention of you or anything that you knew so that it didn't happen, as far as they're concerned, or anybody who lives in their world is concerned. The emperor in 91 AD was Domitian, a young son of a bitch become almost a middle-aged, terrific demon. And he saw that the previous year in 90 AD, odd things were beginning to happen exactly there where the trouble spot was picked in 70 AD by his father, Vespasian. That Vespasian had sent his eldest son, Titus, to teach the Jews a lesson that they will never forget. They're not only going to be conquered, they're already conquered. They are going to be served notice, not as a warning, but as an abject horror to all who would ever see them in destroying, effacing the temple from this earth. The temple that King David wanted to build and realized that he was not going to be able to build because he had lived too much in carnage. But that his son, Solomon, the son of deep love with Bathsheba, who had been promised the inheritance of the kingship, of the kingdom, it was given over to Solomon. Not at a time in great pomp. David's most powerful son was named Absalom. And he had just simply said to the troops that he took over, if you find my father, kill him. Absalom was not only rich and handsome and wealthy, but he knew that everybody else will know this because I will show them there is no alternative to your not knowing this about me. You thought you understood egotism? It's like that. And old King David, who could not get warm, as the annals talk about, fled across Jordan into the encampment area that Joshua had rallied the people after Moses had finally died and passed away. They buried Moses on the lower slopes of Mount Nebo, and it was there in a place where a streamlet comes into the Jordan River, and that's called Wadi Karar. And it's there that Joshua said to all of the men who had been born in the 40 years coming up to the exile, only Joshua and another older man named Caleb were the only who had survived. Everybody else had been born in the exile, in that 40 years in the wilderness. It's there that King David went, bringing the heartache with him, and it's there that the prophet of the day, his name was Nathan, took Bathsheba and the maturing Solomon with him to King David's encampment, and he said, this is your heir, the inheritor of your kingdom, not flashy Absalom who wants to kill you. This is Solomon who will be king because he is the one who's going to build the temple. He's the one that is going to take what was a construction job and make an architecture out of it. An architecture on the level of a Chartres cathedral, some 2,100 years later. Chartres and Solomon's temple have a time-form relationship. It's not quite apparent yet until realizing that Solomon, when he built his temple, he more and more turned towards the Absalonic way of inheriting the kingdom, and he began to squander what had been gifted to him. Not given, gifted. And refused to even meet his son, who was a son of his, like he was of his father David. That the son was not a son of an ordinary concubine or an ordinary wife, but of one of the most extraordinary women of all time, the Queen of Sheba. And that son's name was Menelik, and he was part African, like his mother, who was all African. She writes of herself in her great classic, The Song of Songs, "I am dark but comely. And I know wisdom when I hear it, and I don't visit when I don't hear it." And so the Queen of Sheba was like Sheba. David and Sheba, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. You have to understand, it's not just parallels, they're resonances of a harmonic. That harmonic is still singing. What do you think the choirs of angels are about? They're not about hypnotic, threat-mongering, grayish things, or would-be star system warlords. Nothing to do with it whatsoever. They're extraneous, and we know it. We've always known it. They had better watch out. Our wings are dry. The way in which Domitian engineered the murder of his older brother Titus, who was emperor only for 2 years and then died of an infection, and Domitian would not allow any physicians into him. Why would he do that? Not just because he was a really vicious, demonic character, but because his older brother fell in love with a Jewish queen. She was even 10 years older than Titus. She was, in fact, the daughter of King Agrippa, and Cyprus, his wife, and she had been married to one of the upcoming, beautiful, powerful young men in the world at the time, named Marcus Julius Alexander. And Marcus Julius Alexander was a nephew of Philo of Alexandria. And their family, named Alexander, because they were brought to Alexandria before it was built. When it was founded in the vision of Alexander the Great, he brought a number of international talented Jewish merchants so that Alexandria could have the foundations of a new planetary scale of humanity. Alexandria was not a Greek city, but was supposed to be the world city. And in order to have that kind of a concourse throughout the world, he realized that the most ancient international trading caravan interests were the North Semitic people since the time of Sargon of Akkad. So he brought talented, and among the talented Jews that were brought before 300 BC, when Alexander was laying out the plans for the way in which Alexandria would be built, much like Scarlett laid out the plans for Chartres about 1100 AD. So that by the time bronze got there to really begin building, it was about 1119 AD, which is a formative year. It's another trigger year. And when one begins to understand history hermetically, one understands that the guidance is truthful and trustworthy. And you don't need belief, you do it. And in the doing of it, it's done. And it's done so that it not only lasts, but it encourages the learning that will allow for it to be sustained. Because in this world, the normal sustaining is not just a lifetime. There is like about a 3-generation window where that's about as good as it gets, and then it begins to have an atrophy unless there are more dimensions brought into play consciously, because it's conscious differentiation and kaleidoscopicness that allows for the blossoming to not only continue, but to be a real continuum. Domitian refused any doctors to come to Titus, and Titus eventually died of a complication of the infections. And when Domitian was emperor, he tried to parade himself as a big do-it-all, and he realized that one of the difficulties was that Marcus Julius Alexander had died young, leaving a widow, and the widow had been forced by her father Agrippa to marry an old, powerful man for a couple of years. And then when Titus was sent to Judea, to Jerusalem, to destroy the temple, his number one general was the younger brother of Marcus Julius Alexander. His name was Tiberius Julius Alexander, because he was born in the year at the time, late in the year, when Augustus Caesar died after ruling the world for 44 years. And Tiberius, his inheritor, came in. And so Tiberius Julius Alexander was the number one general for the Roman army underneath Titus, who was the eldest son and the emperor to be under Vespasian. So that at the very most powerful levels in world history, the temple in Jerusalem had been effaced because it was no longer real in terms of actuality. But in 90 AD, a council of those who were like the grandsons got together with the fathers, the sons of those who had been in charge of the temple, met in a Judean city, Jamnia, near the coast, not on the coast, but nearer there. And the Council of Jamnia established what is called Rabbinical Judaism. We will not change an iota of the Torah, of the prophets, of the wisdom books. They will remain exactly as they are now. And in 2014, the Masoretic text is exactly that of the Council of Jamnia in 90 AD. Not one jot has been changed. Now you can freeze dry for that kind of efficacy of being able to understand, and it's worthwhile having. But you cannot live by it, and so what was decided wisely, and those who decided were called the sages, is that we're going to modify commentaries on the text. And we can argue and have new ways of having commentaries, and the commentaries are going to be housed at a place of real power that lasts. Okay, it can't be Jerusalem. Certainly not going to be Rome. Not going to be Constantinople. We'll put it in ancient Babylon, and we will call this group of commentaries the Talmud, and it will be the Babylonian Talmud. There was another Talmud that came up in Judaism, but the Babylonian Talmud runs to about 10 thick volumes, even in translation. In really nice editions of it, it runs closer to 20 volumes, which are published now in beautiful color and size. I'll bring some of those volumes next presentation as well. All of that came to a poignant fruition in the late 1000s, and it was a man named Gershom ben Judah who organized the Talmud and the Masoretic text that was unchanged and went with it, so that it would be the foundation of a very powerful 12th century Judaism in northern France. Exactly at the same time that Gothic cathedrals were for the first time being understood that they can be built. At the very same time. And next week we'll see how all of that confluence came together with trying to have a Christian military re-seizing through crusades of the Holy Land and making a Jerusalem which is Christian. We're going to make a new temple. It's Christian, not going to be Jewish at all. Not going to be Islamic at all. And all of that comes to a crunch with the Templars and with the fact that someone standing in the way were Eloise and Abelard, because they, at that crunch, the successor to Gershom was Rashi, who raised the commentaries to a level of refined art. And all of this happened in Troyes, in Champagne, France, next within a day's distance to Chartres. Troyes is about the same distance from Paris as Chartres is. It makes an equilateral triangle. More next week.